and start here. So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about cross-cultural views on morality, religion, and justice. And if we were to start, the sense of morality, we talk about it being subjective. There's not one uniform view of morality, and typically it's shaped by various codes that fluctuate or vary across culture. We also understand that what we consider in the realm of morality or outside of the realm of morality fluctuates across culture as well. Now, let's start with, just a thought. So I'd like to ask the question, how many of you think that murder is wrong? And you could use your hand raise tool for this if that's easier. Is there anyone who, all right, I see a couple hands up. So, all right, let's let the poll come in. All right. So for those of you who don't have your hand up, is it safe to assume that you think murder is so acceptable? Anyone want to explain their position? Anastasia, you had your hand up. Why did you take the position you did?
Because I don't know, I just believe that murder is wrong. Like,
Mhm.
why would you want to go and kill someone?
Right.
You're just going to end up in jail.
Okay, that's fair. Now, let me throw a question at you. If there was a person who broke into your house and they threatened your life, would you consider that acceptable in self-defense?
Like, if I was to do the act against them,
Mhm.
like if I was to do the act against them if they're threatening me,
Correct.
yeah, I would take that as self-defense.
And that would be acceptable, right?
Yeah.
So why do I bring this up, right? Because in our society, there are certain conventions where we accept that, the rule is thou shalt not kill, right? We're influenced by more of a Abrahamic faith perspective, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's a very strong push, thou shalt not kill. It's in the Bible. But when it comes to things like self-defense, we're like, okay, that's an exception to the rule, right? In war, we view that as an exception to the rule. So there are conventions of war where certain things are acceptable, certain things are not acceptable. For example, with the whole crisis going on in Ukraine, we would say, there are some war crimes being committed, right? That's the argument from westernized nations. And why is it that there are war crimes being committed? Because civilians are being attacked. Whereas if these were soldiers on the battlefield, there would not necessarily be as much of an issue, right? So we would say, okay, well, if one army is fighting another army, that's understandable that there's going to be people killed. Now, the act is still considered murder, right? But in a wartime situation, it's considered an exception to the rule where we consider it acceptable. Now, when I say we, I don't want it to be understood as a universal, because even within societies, there are those who do not believe that one should commit murder ever, even in war, right? There are people who are pacifists. There are people who do not believe war is a justifiable reason. And they take a different perspective. So why am I bringing this all up? Because we have certain conventions, certain acceptable standards within our society, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that everywhere across the globe they're going to agree, and even within our society they're going to agree. And I see Strahinya said just war or a just war is a myth, right? So there are a lot of people who take that position that, you know, war as a whole is a myth, meaning that it's acceptable, right? So, you know, there's going to be variability in this position. So, but there are other parts of the globe where, you know, thou shalt not kill is not necessarily, you know, a part of their moral code, right? And that's just a very good example where morality is subjective, both within and across cultures. Okay. There's another, you know, issue that I want to bring up. We talk about morality, you know, has historically been linked to some kind of religious explanation, although there's great research to suggest that, you know, people who are secular are not any less moral on average relative to their counterpart. So you don't necessarily need to be religious to be moral. However, there is this secularization theory, which suggests that as the world progresses, there is going to be less and less reliance on religion to explain the world around us, right? So if we were to look at the United States and the perception of religion, you know, we see that people are far less religious than they were before. But, you know, that is one part of the world. There are other parts of the world where we see that they're not less religious. We see religion going up, increasing, and we see that religion is being used more to explain the world around us. So the idea of this secularization theory, this occurs more in Western nations. It doesn't occur as much in other parts of the world. So it's very important to understand that this secularization theory might make sense in places like Europe and the United States, but it doesn't always match in other parts of the world. Now, if we were to go back to the introduction to psychology, you probably would have been taught about Kohlberg and Kohlbergs stages of morality. And he has 6 stages of morality that are technically 3 large stages with 2 substages in each, right? And this was one of the most influential models of morality. And Kohlberg suggested that these 3 levels, which have 2 sub-levels in each, are universal. So the suggestion is that everybody goes from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 if they get there. Now, I do think it's important to note that Kohlberg's theory is criticized. It's criticized on several fronts. One criticism that has been leveled against Kohlberg's stage theory is that the dilemmas that people are put through. These dilemmas are very much justice-oriented, which favor males over females. And there was a researcher by the name of Gilligan who criticized Kohlberg, who said that if the dilemmas were more based on compassion rather than justice, women would outperform men, right? Because Kohlberg suggested that males tended to score higher than females. And the other criticism is that if this is, an invariant sequence, everybody is supposed to go through all of the stages in theory. But what we find is that different parts of the world, there isn't necessarily transcending to stage 5 and 6. So if you are in more of the Western world, maybe you would get to stage 5 and 6. But if you were perhaps in a tribal nation like New Guinea, you may not necessarily get to 6. So these are some criticisms of his theory. But when we talk about the 3 general stages, there is pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional morality. When we talk about pre-conventional morality, here we're talking about things like reward and punishment, right? So why are people moral? It's because they want to seek a reward for doing good behavior, and they want to avoid punishment for misbehavior, right? But, that is a very, very basic level of morality. Eventually, people move to what's called conventional morality. And what is conventional morality? It goes beyond just reward and punishment. In conventional morality, now you're focused on what is considered right and wrong based on the laws or conventions of your society. So in conventional morality, your decision of right and wrong might be based on what society says is right or wrong, right? So stealing, for example, right? If you were to ask a person, is it okay to steal? In the pre-conventional morality stage, a person might say no, because you're going to get punished for stealing, or your parents are going to be upset with you. In conventional morality, you might hear someone say that, no, it's not acceptable to steal because there are laws that say you're not allowed to steal. It's against the law, right? So that's conventional morality. Post-conventional morality would be that you're transcending the laws or conventions of society to come up with your own perspective on morality. So you might say, no, it's not okay to steal because it's just wrong to steal. Why is it wrong? I just feel it's wrong, right? That would be where you are coming to your own view of morality that's independent of necessarily what society says. Now, the same way you could have people use these pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional arguments to say it's not acceptable to steal, you might say that it is okay to steal, right? So in a pre-conventional argument, you might hear a person say, it's okay to steal because I wanted the candy bar and the shop owner has many of them and candy bars taste good, right? They have a lot, I don't have any, and I want some. So it's about pleasure, right? And in that case, that's pre-conventional. In the case of conventional morality, you might say, well, the law might say that thou shalt not steal, but it's there are exceptions to the rule, right? There are, in my circumstance, I might need to steal, right? Or the law says you can steal X, but Y is not part of the law, or things of that nature. So you might also seek approval of your peers. My peers think it's okay to steal, so it's okay to steal. And then post-conventional morality is that you're able to critique the law and say the law is flawed. In this case, the law does not apply to the situation at hand. Now, here is one of perhaps the most famous examples of a moral dilemma that Hines had, or I should say Kohlberg had about Hines. I want you to read this scenario, and I want you to determine whether Hines did the right thing or not, and why. So please take a moment to read the moral dilemma. Is there anyone who wants to weigh in and decide whether Hines did the right thing or not, and why?
I can try. I mean, in this case, there are two ways to explain this. Why is it good and why is it not good?
Well, I just, hold on. I only want to hear your perspective, whether it's good or not. Just pick one side.
To be honest, I would have done the same. So if I was desperate, I would have done it. But if I think that others, if I do it, then others would do it. Through that perspective, I wouldn't do it. But if somebody, my loved one, and if I was in that position, I think I would have done the same no matter what are the consequences. So that's the answer.
Because, so regardless of the consequences, you would have done it because
my loved one is like, their life isn't the question. So I would not, like, if I can do something about it, then I would do it. And if the only way to do it is to like rob a store and steal the drug and then go to prison, I think I would do it no matter what. So
yeah. Fair enough. Right. Any other thoughts? Anyone want to say it's wrong, period? Okay. Well, you could see how this is not clear cut. Now, I said just pick a side, but these are called dilemmas for a reason, right? A dilemma is where, there might be an argument to be had for both sides. Now, I said that the three stages of morality have two sub-stages, right? So what was suggested is an argument that is pretty much post-conventional morality, right? And that doesn't shock me. Now, technically, I would argue it's stage 5, right? So I mentioned there are 3 general stages, but I really should give you all 6 of them. So in pre-conventional morality, we have a punishment and obedience orientation. and an instrumental relevance orientation. What do I mean by a punishment and obedience orientation? The focus is on punishment, right? So it would be okay to do it in this context if you wouldn't get caught, let's say. Now, an instrumental or relevance perspective, right? That's stage 2, still pre-conventional, would be based on, well, if it feels good, do it. So it's kind of like, well, you know, if it feels good to steal, do it. And I kind of gave the example of a candy bar, right? Which was kind of like that. Now, in conventional morality, you have the good boy, nice girl stage, where now you're seeking some kind of approval of others, and the law and order orientation. So stage 3 is good boy, nice girl. Stage 4 is law and order. So in good boy, nice girl, now you're looking for a pat on the back, right? So approval or disapproval by one's parents, friends, community. These are all stage 3. And then law and order is based on your duty. So do your responsibility or do your duty. So if the law says you shall not steal, or that it's a criminal offense, then you shouldn't steal. Now, the post-conventional morality, as I said, that's where you're starting to shift beyond the law. So stage 5 is a social contract orientation, right? So if we were to think about the purpose of law, the purpose of law is to protect society. And in this particular case, the law is actually interfering with protecting society. And that is why, you know, in my case, I might steal, right? So, you know, your peer said, you know, if I were in that situation, I would steal, right? But it's the focus is on life versus property, right? So if the law is thou shalt not steal, that's a property-based law, a material-based law. But how much do you value life? So if this law is interfering with the sanctity of life, then maybe this law is either obsolete or flawed. That's more of social contract, right? So, and then, you know, stage 6, which not everybody gets to, is what's called a universal ethical principle law. That's where you come to your own sense of morality, which is like, well, why is it wrong? I just think it's wrong, right? Because stealing is inherently wrong. So you come to your own perspective of morality. And, you know, questions you might ask is, well, what if everybody chose to steal, right? I know I'm coming to a point of, well, this is my loved one and I'm trying to save my loved one's life, but what if everyone came to that position? Then we would have chaos, we would have anarchy. And that would be an argument that was more like universal ethical principles, post-conventional. So you could see that even within the 3 general stages, there are layers, right? There are 2 layers within each. So I want you to be mindful of that, because, you know, it's kind of, you know, hard to say what we would actually do unless we were in this situation, but we can come up with either justifications for or against our actions based on whatever position we come up with. Now, I said to you that, you know, here we are, pre-conventional morality, right? So pre-conventional morality focuses on reward and punishment. So stage 1, I said, was punishment and obedience. Stage 2 is about reciprocity. So I refer to it as the instrumental relevance stage, but you might hear people say, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So it's more about reciprocity. Conventional is about social rules. So I told you about the good girl, nice boy. Orientation, which is more about the approval of others. And then stage 4 is about the rules of authority. And then, when it comes to post-conventional morality, here we have a transcending the rules, right? So stage 5 is social contract orientation, where rules are designed to ensure the greater good. And if this isn't protecting the greater good, then maybe this rule should be reconsidered. And then stage 6 is, a universal, internal view of morality, right? So all in all, we tend to see that in pre-conventional morality, people focus on what's going to give them the best return, right? So reward and punishment. In conventional morality, people are focused on maintaining social order. And then in post-conventional morality, we tend to see people coming to more abstract reasoning, focusing on individual rights versus just the rules. Now, what should not shock you is that from a meta-analysis, not everyone gets to post-conventional morality. So you can see here that if Kohlberg was suggesting that this was a universal, there's a problem here, right? So if we were to look post-conventional morality, no one from traditional tribes or villages reason at this level. And then if we saw Western societies, people oftentimes reason at this level. So what's the issue here? Well, from a pragmatic point of view, perhaps, that post-conventional abstract reasoning may not be relevant to day-to-day living. That's first and foremost for some people in traditional tribes and villages. Another suggestion is that in order to reach post-conventional morality, it's heavily dependent on formal education. So in the absence of formal education, people may not meet post-conventional morality. They may not reach post-conventional morality. And that is, that's a problem. To me, I think it's a problem in the theory. All right, so as I said, one issue is education, right? So the education in the West allows people to reach the 3rd level. And there is a Western bias or ethnocentric bias that suggests that the post-conventional morality is the best. But as I said, from a pragmatic point of view, there are some societies where maybe dealing with that which is rather than a hypothetical is more important. So not so simple, right? And in terms of the challenges we face, there are issues, unique challenges in each culture. So perhaps the moral values of other societies are not reflected in Kohlberg's model. So where does this leave Kohlberg? Where does this leave, the idea of, Kohlberg's theory of moral development? It leaves it as it is a useful framework, but it is limited cross-culturally. That's the biggest criticism. It's useful, but limited, and it does not fully capture morality across the globe. Now, I bet you that when you took Introduction to Psychology, you had to learn about Kohlberg's stage theory of morality. And if it wasn't an intro to psychology, you probably learned about it in developmental psychology. And it's in this particular class where we start to see that these general theories that you learned continue to come up against, universality, right? As we said in the first lecture, universality suggested that we could take two cultures from extremely different societies and value system, and they should get the same outcome. And we're not seeing that here with Kohlberg's theory of moral development. So as much as he suggested that this was a universal, we can't endorse it as being universal. Any thoughts or reactions to that? Let me go into, if you have any thoughts, feel free. If not, we can continue. Okay. So in addition to the criticism about, cross-cultural universality, right, that we talked about, Carol Gilligan, it's interesting, Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan both they were both at Harvard. So they shared a floor at Harvard in the psych department, and they couldn't have been more different in their view in morality. And the rooms were adjacent to one another. But to me, I think that's cool. So Carol Gilligan suggested that the post-conventional component of Kohlberg's theory was also biased in favor of males. And she suggested that males and females have different perspectives on moral development. And it has what to do with how people are raised. And we tend to train males to think in rule-bound ways, right and wrong, just, unjust, whereas we tend to raise women in society focused on caring and compassion. So if that is the case, then we would suggest that Kohlberg's theory of development is androcentric or biased in favor of males. And if we were to have a different set of moral dilemmas that were based on caring and compassion, then maybe the results would be different. Now, I will tell you that Carol Gilligan's criticism also has criticism. So for example, Christina Huff Summers, which is another researcher, said that this logically makes sense what Carol Gilligan is saying, but there wasn't sufficient support for her argument. So she being Carol Gilligan, overstates her case. So in the end, we still are left with considering it more androcentric, but the idea that women are more focused on caring and compassion, there isn't sufficient evidence for that cross-culturally. Ronaldo.
So, I mean, when they say there is insufficient evidence, sorry about the noise, but when they say there's insufficient evidence, I don't know, just like women are natural born like carers, they're mothers. So like they're like, it's kind of like instinct to them to be more caring and compassionate. So like them saying there's not enough evidence is, I don't know, just doesn't sit right with me. But like, she is right in that Kohlberg's theory is flawed and only considers men. But the thing is that like nowadays, both men and women, it just depends on how you're raised, to be honest. Because you could be a man raised by a woman and you could end up becoming more compassionate and caring, or as if the mother or the parent is compassionate and caring, or if they are more rule-based, then you'll be you grow up to, be that way. It just depends on how you're raised and who raised you and what you believe in.
Well, you're actually making one of the arguments that Christina Huff Summers made, right? Which is that males can be raised to be caring and compassionate. Females can be raised to be rule-bound thinking. And in her book, I think it was called War Against Boys, she critiques Carol Gilligan. And what it is, and she brings things like that, exactly what you said, which is it depends on how you're raised. Now, the biggest problem that Kohlberg and Gilligan face is that they're stating things in universals, right? So it is true that women in general are raised in societies and taught to operate based on care and compassion. But does that mean that all women are caring and compassionate? That's the criticism, that it's not a universal. She overstates it. If that were the case, then we wouldn't have, hypothetically, women killing their kids, right? Or we would never have something like postpartum depression that alters one's feelings of wanting to care and compassion. We would never have some people saying, I don't want to have kids, right? So the idea of birthing and raising kids, right, is part of the premise here with Carol Gilligan. And there are a lot of women who are opting out of having kids because they don't want to take care of kids, right? So look, I would be careful to speak in absolutes anyway. So if I were to take the criticism of Carol Gilligan, I don't think anyone is saying that Carol Gilligan isn't onto something, right? But both Gilligan and Kohlberg spoke in the sense of universals. And whenever you can find exceptions to the rule, then you cannot state that it's universal. That's the premise that I'm presenting to you from Christina Huff Summers. I'm not suggesting that Christina Huff Summers is right. I just want you to know, A, the cross-cultural criticisms of Kohlberg, B, the androcentric view of Kohlberg, the responses to the androcentric view of Kohlberg. This is what I kind of wanted to get to. Iram?
Yeah, I also think that we should also look at how she defines caring and compassion, what she defines to a compassionate and caring person, and to what extent she measures that. Because as you mentioned, some women don't want to be a mother, like to have a child, but that doesn't mean they are not compassionate or caring.
100%. 100%, right? Because caring and compassion can manifest in other ways. But are women inherently more caring and compassionate than men? Right? That's a question I don't know. I like what Ronaldo said, which is that males can also be caring and compassionate. And there are many societies where males are indeed, they take on that role. Naldo, you had your hand up.
I was just gonna agree with what Iram said and like with the definition of being caring and compassionate. And like it's hard to to talk about these things when these definitions are like relative, and is what do you consider being caring and compassionate is difficult.
I agree. And you know what? I'm glad we're having the discussion at this level, right? Because, a lot of the general theories that are put forth in psychology they're based on a set of assumptions. And how do we define caring and compassionate? How do we define rule bound? These kind of things. As soon as we start to really do a deeper dive, we start to see a more relativistic view, a more subjective view. So it would look more in line with what you and Iram are saying, perhaps, than what Kohlberg and Gilligan were saying, right? Maybe we would agree with Gilligan based on her definition. Maybe we would agree with Huff Summers. I don't know, right? But the point is, it's hard to embrace universals because we can see the exceptions to the rules, both with males and females, right? So the idea that females are more compassionate, we have criticisms of that based on other females. We have criticisms based on males. The fact that males are rule bound, we have criticisms of that too, right? So it's kind of like we have to be very careful about general statements. That's what I would like to leave us with is, in the end, I do believe that Kohlberg's design was androcentric. I do agree with Carol Gilligan's criticism. Now, but we have to also be careful not to flip to the opposite extreme, right? So when we're in a debate, there is a tendency to say, well, you made position X, well, I'm going to take Y on the opposite extreme. The truth is somewhere in the middle, which is kind of where we're discussing. For example, I'll give you another example where this kind of opposite polarity or reaction happened. When we talk about Freud and his view of penis envy, right? He believed that females were jealous of males because they have penises and they lacked them. So somehow females were jealous of males. And it wasn't, the biggest criticism of that was it's not the organ necessarily of a penis that females are jealous of. It is the, discomfort within society that males are afforded privileges that females are not, right? So that tends to be what we say. But there was a psychoanalyst by the name of Karen Horney who went to the opposite extreme, who suggested that males have womb envy. Females don't have penis envy, but males have womb envy because females can produce life. And that too, again, when you go from one extreme to the other, that can be criticized because what comes with bringing forth life, there are a lot of males, if you ask them honestly, they would not want to undergo the suffering of prenatal development and labor and delivery, right? So it's both arguments understood where they come from, but the truth is somewhere in the middle. Does that make sense? And I think that what Carol Gilligan fell into was the extreme opposite argument of Kohlberg. That's what I believe. So if there was a softer criticism, not an absolute criticism, perhaps, I don't know if Huff Summers would have even criticized Carol Gilligan. I don't know if I'm making sense. Am I making any sense? Because everything in the absolute can be criticized. As soon as you find cases that don't support it, then we have problems. All right. So when we talk about morality, there are, according to Schweter, there are three seemingly universals in ethics, right? So the ethic of autonomy, which is all about individual freedom and rights. The ethic of community, which is your responsibility to your society around you. So your duty to the community and whatever hierarchical structure there is. And then the ethic of divinity, right? So the idea that natural order is preserved by some kind of transcendental authority. So if we were to look at these moral ethics, right? So the ethic of autonomy suggests that morality is there to protect justice and individual rights. And the focus is on those people who are either harmed or denied their rights or treated unfairly. If we were to look at Kohlberg, his model would fit very nicely into the ethic of autonomy, right? Because it's all about justice principles. But when we look at the ethic of autonomy, there are two different structures at play. And forgive me, I'm probably going to butcher this because I don't speak German. But there's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, right? So Gemeinschaft is more focused on the community, where interpersonal relationships are very, very important. So the focus is on your relationships, right? And Gesellschaft is more focused on what we would think largely as society, or more or less our social obligations, right? So it's all about social conventions or rules, right? So there are different social structures at play that we have to consider. The second of the three seemingly universals is the ethic of community, right? So when we talk about morality, morality is oftentimes linked to interpersonal obligations, and we focus more on loyalty and betrayal and the inability to fulfill one's roles and responsibility, right? So that's the ethic of community. So when we talk about moral obligations, they could either be an objective obligation. What is an objective obligation? Something that should be done, and I put should in quotes, but something that is done, but you don't need someone to tell you that, right? You don't need a rule to exist to do it. So that's pretty objective. And then there are legitimately regulated rules, right? So here, perhaps the obligation is not clear cut, but there are rules that are put in place to prevent people from doing things that are considered socially unacceptable. And if people violate those legitimately regulated rules, they should be punished for them. Now, from this point of view, though, if it's not a moral obligation, then it is something that is either a convention of society or your personal choice, right? Now, the third ethic is ethic of divinity. And there's a focus on sanctity. There's a focus on the sacred world, and things like a belief in God is part of the ethic of divinity. So whatever is considered moral is mandated by some kind of transcendent authority, right? So God suggests that you're supposed to or not supposed to do a certain thing. And then based on God's word, we're supposed to adhere to whatever the rules that were set forth. Now, it's interesting, though, when we talk about morality, we have issues where, we have issues where people don't fit universally into one box or the other, right? So what do we do if we had competing ethics, right, against one another, right? Well, that's going to create some form of a moral dilemma, right? So the example of the Heinz dilemma was the focus on either sanctity of life relative to the laws of stealing, right? So there are two competing values that are pulled against one another. So when we talk about orthodox versus progressive moral reasoning, so orthodoxy would say that, you know what, there's been a transcendental authority that has existed since the beginning of time, and the moral code should stay the same even if society changes. So from a point of orthodoxy, even if society changes, the rules should not be broken. The rules set forth should not be violated. Whereas a progressive point of view would say, okay, there's a transcendental authority, it does exist, but humans are empowered or bestowed with the ability to formulate moral codes, and these moral codes have to adapt to what's happening today, what's happening in our societies as a whole. So from a progressive point of view, there is a belief that even with the acknowledgement of a transcendental authority, rules can change, morality can change. So if we were to look at arguments made when we talk about dilemmas that are put forth by orthodox and progressivist individuals, right? So this was done in a Baptist Christian community, Orthodox Baptist versus progressive Baptists, right? When we looked at justifications for moral dilemmas with the Orthodox Baptists, they tended to focus more on the ethic of divinity, which makes sense, right? It's God's word. God's word should not be broken, period, full stop. When we look at progressivists, the ethic of divinity was actually the least taken justification for moral decision making. The focus on autonomy and community were much greater than divinity. And that kind of makes sense too, right? So yes, obviously progressivist Baptists acknowledged the power of God, but addressing one's role within society and taking care of people and injustices within society, the rules might need to be adapted to address that. Now, I don't know how many of you have taken religion classes, but if you've taken a course on religion, you will find that every faith has a spectrum. Pardon me, I don't want to get into absolute. Most faiths have a spectrum of belief and practice. So if we were to take Christianity, for example, you have Catholicism, Protestantism, we have Orthodox Christianity, which has two subdivisions, and then we have other miscellaneous Christian groups, right? So there are 4 different large denominations within Christianity, and you will see their attitudes, their position on social issues are not universal. So when you start to look at attitudes towards birth control, this is an example. If you were to ask for a general ruling within Catholicism, there would be less acceptability among Catholic priests relative to Protestant communities, right? So in Protestant communities, there would be more acceptability. What's the point? The point is that the ethic of divinity for Catholic individuals and to some extent Orthodox Christian individuals transcends the other ethics, right? Whereas in many Protestant movements, the focus of autonomy and community transcend. I'll give you another example. Judaism has a similar thing. We have Orthodox Judaism, conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, and then we have other miscellaneous Jewish communities to the level of people who are culturally Jewish but don't even go to house of worship, right? Orthodox Judaism is going to load more towards the ethic of divinity, whereas conservative and Reform Judaism are going to load more towards the ethic of autonomy and community. And I could keep going on with many other communities and show you how it's not a universal. Within a religion, there's heterogeneity. That's what I'm trying to highlight. So it wasn't just Orthodox versus Progressive Baptist. It could be any community. And I'm aware that the Baptist community is one sub-denomination of Protestant Christianity. I want to put that out there. But there are other Protestant communities as well. All right. So Jonathan Haidt elaborated on the previous model and presented harm avoidance, loyalty to in-group, respect for hierarchy, the goal of achieving purity and fairness. Now you will see that harm avoidance and fairness load to autonomy, loyalty to an in-group and hierarchy load towards community, and purity loads towards divinity. So if we were to look at the financial amount people make and their self-reported political identity, right? Pardon me, I didn't present that right. If we were to look at one's reported political identity and the amount of money it would take them to violate one of the taboos of society, what would it take? You will see that it fluctuates across the standard. So when it comes to things like fairness, to violate the rule of fairness, that actually is one that requires the most amount of money to violate. When it comes to authority, it requires the least amount of money. And then the others kind of fluctuate across one's political identity. But what we tend to see is that in general, people are very conservative, feel more strongly about all 5 of these ethics, right? Of these additional Jonathan Haidt ethics, right? So you'll see that the graph tends to slope upward, right? In general, right? With one exception when we look at harm, right? That fluctuates the other way. So long story short is that these additional 5 elements suggest that people who are more conservative are absorbing all the 5 ethics more into the ethic of divinity. So fairness, authority, purity, all of these things get absorbed into the ethic of divinity. And that's why it requires more financial resources to get them to violate their taboo in principle. All right. Again, there's also a divide in terms of morality of thoughts between Judaism and Christianity, right? So if we were to think about one's thoughts versus behaviors in the New Testament, which is, again, you have the Old Testament, the New Testament. The Old Testament is what most Jewish individuals adopt. The New Testament is the additional pieces of the Bible that were added through Christianity. So if we were to read and compare the Old Testament versus the New Testament, the focus is more on behavior over thoughts. Now, I will tell you, as someone who knows about Judaism, this is the only faith that I consider myself somewhat of an expert on. I will tell you that Judaism does regulate thoughts. There is something called impure thoughts, but that is true, that the focus is on, okay, you can have the thought as long as you don't engage in the action, right? Because we can't always control our thoughts. So within the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, the focus is more on what you do versus what you think. Whereas in the New Testament, your private thoughts are part of the moral domain as well. So the impurity of thoughts is also of equal importance. All right. So this is a discussion that actually has come into society, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020, a discussion of fairness, right? Culture and fairness. What is considered fair? Well, you could argue fairness is based on equality. That is, everybody should get a shared amount of whatever resources are there. So everyone gets the same resources. That's the concept of equality. Whereas the principle of equity is based on contribution. And we colloquially actually define equity more similarly to need, by the way. Whereas the principle of need is resources are distributed based on those who need it the most. So now here, these are famous pictures that you probably have seen in trying to highlight the difference between equality and equity. Your book defines it differently than most DEI individuals, right? So, but I want you to appreciate equality, everybody gets the same. So if you were to look at the boxes, so let's say you're trying to watch a baseball game and you had 3 boxes, everybody gets 1 box in the principle of equality across the board. Now that's not helpful to, for example, the youngest child who wants to watch the game, but 1 box is not going to do it, right? Equity would be where it's based on either contribution or need. Now, in this case, everybody in a sense of equity gets to watch the ball game, right? And that's a different view of fairness. Well, the youngest child needs 2 boxes to see the game, so they get 2 boxes. The I guess the teenager, let's say, or preteen needs 1 box, and the adult doesn't need any in that case. So that would be an example. Now, again, I want to make a distinction because I added this slide because I didn't think your book addressed it in the way that we describe it today. So if I were to go back to fairness based on the way your book defines it, equity is based on contribution, and the principle of need is based on those who need it the most. So there are 3 different points of view from your book, whereas we tend to focus on 2. All right. Now, if we were to look at cultures, you would start to see different points of view based on the society or system we live in. So an individualistic system would suggest that we should operate based on meritocracies, which is based on earning it, right? So based on you working hard and earning it, you're going to get a reward, right? So what does this do? This pushes competition and emphasizes strong effort. In collectivistic systems, there's seniority systems. And while it doesn't emphasize working hard as much, it does result in more harmonious relationships. And we've talked about the importance of harmony in collectivistic societies as well. So let's compare a study done with Americans and East Indians who were asked to distribute money for a bonus to 2 employees. The first employee was considered a very effective worker, and the second employee was considered to have a financial challenge due to some kind of illness in the family. So who gets the bonus? If we were to look in the United States, the focus is largely on equity. Now, based on your book's definition of equity, that's based on effort, right? Followed by equality, everyone gets the same, followed by need. So the focus of giving people what they need was less prevalent in the United States. So the person, let's say, who had an illness in the family in the United States is less likely to wind up getting that bonus. Whereas if we were to look at the allocation strategies in India, it's reversed. The focus on need was the number one decision-making strategy, right? Followed by equality, followed by equity. So the person who had the illness in the family would get the bonus over the person who was a hardworking employee, right? So the idea of equity in that sense is less important of a value in India. So does that make sense when we look at, if I were to go back, principle of equality, equity, and need? So again, if your contribution was high, you're emphasizing equity, right? If it's those who need it the most, you're emphasizing need. So we use equity differently. That's why I had that slide again. But when we look at the data set based on your book's definition, you can see in the teal in the United States, we focus hard work rather than need. Okay, no problem. Whereas in India, it's reversed. All right, so let's do another scenario, right? Perception of fairness can be studied through game theory or economic games, such as dictator games, right? So the dictator games goes as follows. 2 people or 2 players were assigned to either be the proposer or the receiver. Now, the proposer and the receiver did not meet. Now the proposer is given some money and they can offer the receiver any amount of this to the receiver. Meaning, so let's say I gave you $1,000 and you could share that with the other player as much as you want. And then the receiver, the person who's in the receiver, has to accept whatever you give them, right? So if we were to think about a a rational solution, that would be to give no money to the receiver at all, right? So that one's personal gain is maximized, right? So we should get it all. In the studies done in the United States, this almost never happens, which is interesting because we tend to be the most individualistic society. We also tend to be capitalistic. So the idea of sharing our resources is counterintuitive. What we tend to see in the United States is that the giver, right, tends to focus on what is fair, and they generally give about 50% at the start of the game. Now, how would you explain that based on an individualistic, competitive point of view? Well, economists suggest this is not a rational point of view, but it evolved as a function of people not wanting to be judged unfavorably, right? So people worried about their reputation. Even though they're competitive, they don't want to be viewed as unfair. So they give 50% so that they're able to be viewed more fairly, right? So that is interesting, right? So, and in capitalistic societies, this view on fairness allows for cooperation and trust. So it is advantageous, right? But it's important to note that the claims that we presented are largely based on Western samples, and there's no clear perspective on what, these claims would be in non-Western samples. So John Henrik tested this in more small-scale societies. And here's what happened in this dictator game, right? So the control group is rural Missouri, right? They gave almost 50%, and that's in your far right. So in the Western society, we're claiming you're going to give 50% to foster trust. But if we were to look at the Hadza in Tanzania or the Yasawa in Fiji, they tend to give far less a percentage of their stake. So the giver tends to give less than one would do in the United States. And that seems counterintuitive. I hope that you're all shocked by this, because we would have thought that in the United States, where the focus is on the self, the independent self, you would give less. Whereas in a lot of these small scale societies, we tend to see them take more of a portion at the onset. So what's at play here? Well, market integration is a player and religion is a player. So you are more likely to give more if you're religiously connected, right? And if somehow it promoted better outcomes in the marketplace. These are the two factors, right? So someone's mic is hot, right? So when we talk about market integration, that's defined as percentage of calories purchased in the market, right? So there's a strong emphasis on fairness there. So because everybody has to eat. And then religion, there's a focus on fairness and in a moral sense. All right. So if I were to pull back, I want to go back and then go forward, right? So when we talk about the dictator games, we have the proposer and the receiver. Based on this particular research, the proposer gave a larger share than we would anticipate in Western society, and the proposer gave a smaller share than we would anticipate in small scale societies, which we had to explain based on two factors being market integration and religion. Okay, so let's see. All right, so another way of looking at this or perception of fairness might be the public goods game. So the public goods game goes as follows, where a group of people are given the same amount of money, and then they could decide how much to contribute to the collective pot, right? So the best way to think about this is if you are preparing for a trip and you have a whole bunch of people going on a trip, and you would ask people to contribute to the cost of the trip. Now, in theory, everybody should give the same amount, right? Because if everybody's going to benefit to the same degree from the trip, you should give the same amount. All right, so you have to decide how much you're going to give, and then from that pot, it's going to keep growing. And then whatever is at that final pot, it gets divided evenly across the group. So as the game continues, what you'll see is that people tend to want to give less and less while still trying to receive a dividend. What's the point? In this scenario, people want to get as much, maximize their return, minimize their risk, right? So if it is anonymous and you put into the pot, people don't know how much you put in. So your original share, you can hold on to as much as possible while still receiving a dividend, right? So if it's anonymous, this can work, but we can also alter you from or shape you against doing this behavior, right? So how do we get you not to give as little as possible while trying to receive a dividend? Well, one is more of an altruistic punishment. So one could say, well, since so-and-so is not contributing, I'll give more of mine, right? And that kind of, the person giving, they're giving more of their share than they really should have to, but it's kind of like a chastisement against the people who didn't put their share in. And then the antisocial punishment would be where someone contributes to punish someone else in a sense of revenge, right? So we might contribute to a cause that is antagonistic to the person who previously punished them. So altruistic versus antisocial punishment. We see that altruistic attitudes tend to be highest in Western societies. There tends to be more civic cooperation in these societies, whereas antisocial punishments increase more where civic cooperation is low and there's more of an emphasis on the rule of law. So the punishment focus of the individual not giving or retaliation of the individual not giving occurs more where civic cooperation is low. All right. So what is considered fair can differ based on collectivism and individualism. So it is considered more fair to find a scapegoat if it's for the betterment of the group. So what is a scapegoat? Someone who's blamed for the problems that society's facing. So if it is necessary to lower the temperatures in a community. A collectivistic society is more likely to scapegoat an individual to promote safety of the whole. Whereas in individualistic societies, scapegoating is less supported or condoned. All right, so what's the summary? So morality can be viewed as either universal, relativistic, or both. So if we were to look at Kohlbergs theory, he tried to promote it as universal. There were some criticisms of Kohlberg's theory suggesting that it was not universal. Then we had Schroeder's view of morality, the three elements, and Jonathan Haidt's sub-breakdown. And we just started to see some of those rules at play. And then we started to talk about the more subjective or relativistic aspects of rules based on the concept of fairness. And what we tended to see is that fairness and the definition of fairness changes across society, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with the acronym WEIRD from our earlier lessons, but Westernized nations, European nations, industrialized nations, and so forth tend to put more of an emphasis on fairness. But the subdomains of morality, according to Jonathan Haidt and all the things we talk about, differ across culture. And that is our lesson. Before I close, I want to throw a question about where we are as a society in the United States in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because I actually think the principle of fairness has shifted in just the last few years. Can anyone suggest some social structures that have been put in place that operate more based on equity versus equality? Naldo?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if this is correct, but I'll like find an example of that.
Is what an example?
Fines.
Fines. Well, fines would be an example of equality. What do I mean by that? So if you park in the wrong place, you get a parking fine. They don't know who necessarily is the owner of that vehicle, but everyone who parks improperly gets a fine. So that would be an operating based on equality.
Well, like, have you heard the saying, you know, like fines were made for like the poor people? I don't know.
Well, that would be the opposite of equity. Equity would be giving people what they need, according to my definition, not your book's definition, versus necessarily equal amounts. That would be the antithesis of equity, if you ask me. So if poor people are disproportionately fined, that's not a fair system, right? So the system has to be shifted. So if we had an income-based fine system, that would be more of an equity situation where, let's say, a person parked improperly and the cost of the fine was $60. But if a person produced their financials to demonstrate that they couldn't afford the 60, the court reduced the fines, that would be more equity. I don't think they do that though. I wish they did. Although there is this judge in Connecticut who appears to be YouTube famous who does things like that. But in general, I don't think the fines operate based on equity. What I do think operates based on equity are minority fellowships, gender fellowships for STEM fields. What do I mean by that? There are specific funding for education and training for women in the natural sciences, such as chemistry, biology, physics, because historically females have been underrepresented. So to give more money to put more women in the field of STEM makes a lot of sense, right? That's equity, giving people what they need, not giving everyone the same amount of money for schooling, let's say. And minority fellowships operates based on the same thing. Due to systematic and structural oppression, which has gone on for centuries, to have specific funding to address the experiences of ethnic minorities, to bring up and bring into certain workforces makes a lot of sense to me. That's equity, to try and make sure that the composition of the workforce reflects the composition of the United States, and that the barriers that have historically been put in place for disenfranchised and underserved communities are removed. That's equity. It's sort of like the 2 milk crates being given to the person who needs it the most, right? Or who wouldn't be able to benefit in a equal way without it, right? So that's equity. And we have a lot of things going in. Even, I have to tell you, corporations have been putting more of a focus on DEI, because historically on boards, there have not been enough gender-based and ethnic-based diversity at the C-suite or executive level. So people are really evaluating policies, and this shift happened. Maybe it's a belated awakening, but it happened after the death of George Floyd. So there's a major shift towards equity. That's been my experience. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts or reaction to that. All right, so let's stop there, and we'll continue next class.